stand while we read the word, please. It comes from John 9, 6 through 11 this morning. Then he spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, "Go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam." Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said he was, and others said, "No, he just looks like him." But the beggar kept saying, "Yes, I am the same one." They asked, Who healed you? What happened?" He told them, "The man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, 'Go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself.' So I went and washed, and now I see." This is the word of God for all people.
Well, good morning again. My name is David, and I get the privilege of being the lead pastor here at LifeBridge for this season. And I want to thank Aaron for sharing lots of opportunities this morning. I did want to say, I know Barbie talked to me a couple weeks ago. She said, "Hey, I want to be able to help drive with students and be able to help with that, and it'd be awesome. Please, anybody else that wants to do that, come talk to me." I will let you know, because of the nature of the students and kind of what they've been through, what they're going through, sometimes literally the next day I'll say, "Great, here's your connection." Other times it's a month later because the student says, "No, yeah, I want to do that, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet." And it's kind of the teachers helping to encourage them. No, this is part of your graduation. We need to get our license and do these things. And so please continue to ask me, and follow up with me, and we'll have the opportunities as soon as we can. Sometimes they're right away, and sometimes they take a little bit longer too. So, but it is an exciting thing to work with these students, and the teachers are amazing, and it's been great to see how much more open they are to conversations about the church than they were 2 or 3 years ago when they first began using this building. So it's an exciting thing. Well, in case you missed last Sunday, I want to give a brief overview of kind of what we talked about with our mission of LifeBridge. And if you want to hear more about it, or you forget, or you want to be reminded, on our website on lifebridgenaz.org, you can read, you can listen to the sermon from last week, watch it specifically about our mission and where we're headed as a local church. But I want to give a brief synopsis again, just to kind of remind us and be on the same page once more. For the last couple of years, our mission has had 3 words in it. Our mission has had encounter, experience, and build. We encounter the grace of God, we experience transformation in Christ, and then we build bridges to Jesus. We encounter God's grace and also try to also give opportunities for others to encounter the grace of Jesus. And we journey alongside people as we're transformed, and we are equipped and try to equip others to build bridges to Jesus too. So that's been our mission for a while. But this last month or two, we've been asking the question, what is our missional focus? Because there are 120,000 plus people who live in our city, we can't journey with every single person. We can't build bridges with every person. We shouldn't try to, because there are dozens of local churches building bridges to Jesus. They don't maybe call it that, but that's what they're doing. And so we're trying not to build the same exact kind of bridges and compete with others, but how do we complement other local churches and work with them in bringing people to Jesus? Over the past month, through our collective prayers and the discernment of our leadership team, we determined that our missional focus specifically was on people who are lonely, people who are unconnected, and those with little family support. And there are thousands upon thousands of people in our city who are very, very lonely. It's been communicated to me. I've lived here 5 years, and over again, we talk about there are lots of people here, but there are lots of lonely people here for many, many different reasons. After talking about those, we concluded 2 things about our focus. The first thing was that everyone a part of LifeBridge is encouraged to love and share the gospel with the life of Jesus with lonely and unconnected people around you. We'll talk about the Bless series in a minute, but we're literally talking about blessing people who live around us. If God puts someone who's lonely in your path, please, you feel the calling to love them and serve them and share the gospel with them. As a whole, as LifeBridge, we're going to have kind of a specific focus within those thousands of people. Our narrower focus as a whole, all of our central programs will revolve around a specific type of lonely people. And those people are the high school graduates, the college graduates, non-traditional college students who are in school for a year or two, or dating someone, or have a child and then don't see that child, or just people who are very much in transition if they're 19, 20, 21 through their mid-20s. And we really realize that there's usually a gap there where people even in the church go through youth ministry, and there might be a college ministry, but we don't live in a college town necessarily, traditional college town. There's no four-year colleges where people come here and live on campus. We have the secondary campuses where students come and go and are very transitional. And so we felt called specifically to love that group of people. And so we're going to kind of continually adapt and say, how do we do this well, Lord? You've called us to love this group of people. How do we do that well? And we're in prayer on continuing to do that and to move forward in different ways. So again, the final thing I said last week was that many of us we don't find ourselves, sadly, I don't even find myself in that place in life anymore, but say this is the mission we're called to together, and together we are on mission to fulfill this calling God's given us to love these people in our city. So again, if you want to know more, you can watch the video from last week, but I wanted just to summarize and remind you where we're headed as LifeBridge. Well, a couple weeks ago, several weeks ago, we began on this Bless series, 5 missional practices to change the world one neighbor at a time. And we've talked about sometimes it's difficult for us to go through the marginalized, who we would call Nazarenes, rejected people in society. Many times we have to start with people around us, our neighbors, and one way we want to do that is through blessing our neighbors, our coworkers, people around us. Every week we've had at the Connect Center, if you need one, a card that says, who are the people and where are the places you're calling me to bless, Lord? And as we've done that, we've gone through 4 of the practices so far. We've gone through the B, which is begin in prayer. We've gone through the L, which is listen to the stories of others around us. The E, everyone's favorite, is eat. The first S, Pastor Janie shared with us 2 weeks ago, is the serve. After we've listened, we can actually go and serve our neighbor. And then today, we're talking about the final S of story. Yes, it refers to this story that we celebrate this time of year, the story on Palm Sunday today where Jesus rode a donkey and walked down and people said, Hosanna, the story of going through this week as we experience the passion experience with Christ's community of Christ dying on the cross, and the gospel story of Easter. Yes, it's that story, but more specifically, the blessed practices emphasize your story and my story, and how the gospel presentation, how the gospel really has transformed my life and those of us who follow Jesus. That's the story we're talking about. That's the story we want to learn how to share. I see people who follow Jesus. We're called Christians at times. We're called disciples of Jesus. But one of the primary things we're called to do and to be are witnesses. Before Jesus ascended into heaven, he gave his disciples instruction and said, you will be my witnesses. Through the power of the Holy Spirit that will come upon you, you will be my witnesses. And the one thing that witnesses do is they testify. They're not usually experts. They don't have all the answers. They don't really, they're not trying to defend something. They're just literally called to communicate what they have seen or heard or experienced. And that's what we are. That's what we'll talk about today, about being a witness for Jesus. I've told you this a few weeks ago, and many of you know Alicia, my wife, but my wife loves crime TV shows, the ones that you want to watch, and I can't watch them at 10 o'clock at night and then go to bed, and I'm like, now I'm going to watch out my window because someone's going to kill me. Those kind of shows. I don't watch them often with her, but when I do, I learn something new. And it seemed to me that every one of those shows, because they're about crime, they all talk about witnesses. There's always a witness somewhere that's seen something or heard something. And the more I watch these shows, it's kind of like on repeat. There's always the same problem. Oftentimes, one of the main problems is that witnesses don't want to testify. It happens in, I would say, 80% of the shows. They have to convince the witnesses, hey, this is why you need to testify. Most of the time, the witnesses have some pretty good reasons why they don't want to testify. Many times, if it's a victim or someone involved, they don't want to bring up the whole story again because it causes them to have post-traumatic stress disorder. It really is painful to bring up that experience. Many of them say, hey, I'm going to testify in a stand, and the person that killed someone's over there, and they might kill me if they know I'm going to testify, and I don't want to die. That's a great reason not to want to testify. That's a great reason to be afraid. There are all sorts of reasons that people give that they don't want to testify. And I realized this past week as I was learning about story that there are many reasons we don't want to testify. I would call them for my life because they're a little more shallow than don't want to die. It's not quite that severe, and so I would call them excuses for me than reasons. But many of us have reasons why we don't want to share our story. And yet time and time again we see in the New Testament that we're called to share our story. We're called to be witnesses. If nothing else, we're called to be witnesses of Jesus, of the kingdom coming that's bringing, and of the transformation that kingdom has brought already to our lives. So I did some research this week, and I found some of the most common reasons that people don't share their story. And I realized all those reasons are wrapped up around kind of being afraid. Not fearful like I'm afraid to look out my windows at night because I'm afraid to go to sleep, but kind of a discomfort, kind of this thing that makes me afraid of doing this. So we'll talk about three of them this morning, and the first one is the word I just said. We have a fear of discomfort, a fear of awkwardness, of not feeling the way I want to feel when I have a conversation with someone. A Barna research study in 2018 found that tension or discomfort was the number one reason that people don't want to talk about their faith. Specifically, Christians don't want to talk perhaps about their life story or about their faith story. From my experience and experience of my friends, it seems like that's very common. We feel like it's going to be uncomfortable because there's already this tension around religion in general and talking about our faith, and therefore I don't want to bring that up, especially in a family gathering, because it just makes things harder, and it's awkward, and I don't want that awkwardness and discomfort, therefore I just will avoid sharing my own story. And so we don't do it. Today we read from John chapter 9. We just read a small piece of the story, but as the story goes, Jesus and his disciples are walking along, and they pass by a man who's been blind from birth. And before what we read, disciples are passing by, and they ask Jesus an obvious question to them. Because of their culture, they say, well, Jesus, this man was blind before he even took a breath. He was born blind, so who sinned? Did he sin to do something wrong, and God punished him before he even sinned? Did his parents sin, and that's why he was born blind? That was a very, very common assumption at that time was if something happened to you, like you were lame or crippled or blind, that means you must have done something wrong to deserve it. They had a very clear connection between sin and bad things that happen. Based on the book of Deuteronomy, it was pretty obvious why they had that connection. And Jesus makes it clear that, yes, that's possible. It happens at times, but it's not always the case. And his response to the disciples is, this man wasn't born blind because someone sinned. He was born blind so that God's works or deeds might be displayed through him. And after that, Jesus makes it obvious why he says that. He heals this man, kind of an unconventional method, but he heals this man. And then several times throughout the chapter, this man shares his testimony. Over and over again, it kind of becomes more concise because people keep asking. And he's like, okay, I just told you this. I'm going to tell you again. Okay, I'll tell you the story again. Well, we read 6 verses of chapter 9, which is over 40 verses long. But the whole chapter is talking about this man's story. From verse 1 to the very, very end, it's talking over and over about this guy's story. Well, starting in verse 13, the religious leaders get involved with the investigation. They must love NCIS too. They think they're investigators. They're not. But they become detectives and say, we're going to figure out what's going on here. And so for about 20 verses, they call this man in, ask them questions. They bring his parents in. They ask questions. They ask anybody about what happened. They say, who healed you? Well, how did he heal you? What exactly did he do? Do you think he's a prophet? Do you think he's a sinner? Did you know it's the Sabbath and he healed you on the Sabbath? They have all sorts of questions. And then they bring him in and ask him the same questions again. And by the end of the story, by the end of the chapter, what was intended to be this amazing thing where God's going to get the glory and Jesus is revealed as this wonderful, wonderful Messiah in a way, instead this man is kicked out of the synagogue and said, no, you didn't give us the right answer. We know who this man is. He's not who you think he is. Because this man does not agree with the religious leaders, it literally says they threw him out. In a sense, it's kind of like being excommunicated, if you know what that means in the church. Now, it's sad, in this specific case, the discomfort, which is very, very severe, is caused by the religious leaders at the time. When they should have been praising God, they're causing pain. When they should have been celebrating the story and telling the story, they were too busy asking questions. Sometimes it's the church, sometimes it's those outside the church that cause the discomfort of why we don't share our story. But either way, we have this fear of this awkwardness, of this discomfort. How will people respond if I tell my story, if I share it? Sharing our story can be uncomfortable. As we talk about all the time, at LifeBridge, we're all about building bridges to Jesus, building relational bridges. We're all about relationships, and we think that's the primary way God's called us to bring people to Jesus. And every relationship involves some kind of story. Usually you build a relationship because someone tells you their story, or you tell part of your story, and you gain a connection of some sort. But somehow, I've been tempted to believe, and many of us in the church are tempted to believe, that sharing our faith story will make people feel uncomfortable, so I shouldn't tell my story. I'm tempted to believe that I need to keep back part of my story for the sake of this bridge that I'm building. But in reality, not sharing a very important piece of me is actually more threatening to the bridge, because then I'm not sharing who I really am, and I'm not sharing, and later they find out, oh, I didn't know that was the case. I didn't know. I'm not building an authentic bridge if I refuse to talk about what's important to me, if it's really important to me. And I'm pretending that faith doesn't matter as much. And in the world, they usually see that pretending as hypocrisy, and that's actually burns more bridges than actually not sharing my story at all. We're not necessarily talking about defending our faith and becoming an apologist or a philosopher, but specifically sharing our story. That's not the first thing I introduce to my neighbors. Hi, I'm David. I'm a pastor. I follow Jesus. How are you? What's your name? I don't do that. Not saying that I should necessarily, but do I wait too long because of a fear of discomfort? Because I'm afraid that's going to make the relationship a little more awkward. That's the first fear we usually have, is discomfort. The second fear we often have is the fear of ignorance. The fear of, what if I don't have all the answers? What if they ask me something about my faith? Like the Pharisees asked this man, well, how did he do it? What does this mean? Do you know who this person was? That same Barna research in 2018 found the second or third, in the top 4, I believe it was, most common reasons is because, quote, people don't feel like they know enough to talk about those spiritual topics. They can share their story, but then what if there are questions? I don't have the answers to those. I don't know what to say. And so we don't share at all. Somehow in the church, especially where we live, in the West we call it, somehow I don't know is not really an acceptable answer. Even a couple weeks ago I was mentoring someone and talking, they were a new believer, and I talked about, or they asked a question, and I knew I had talked about that in seminary several years ago, but I forgot. And it was so hard for me to just say, I don't know, let's look it up and I'll talk to you next week. I don't know why it was such a difficult thing, but afterwards I realized, I got to the I don't know, but it took a long time to actually get there to admit that I didn't remember what the answer was. Oddly enough, when someone else tells me they don't know, it makes me feel better, because I'm like, oh, you don't know everything either. Great. It makes me feel a little bit more comfortable to tell you I don't know the answer either. But for us to say it out loud that we don't know, it's almost a humbling thing that we don't care to experience. Especially as a church leader, as a pastor, as someone who's been to seminary, someone who's been to school for 22 years of my life, and 17 or 18 of those was through Christian education. If anybody knows the answer, I should know the answer by now, right? And then if I don't know the answer, there's a fear there. And yet I remember when Matthew chapter 10, when the disciples had been walking with Jesus not that long, only a year or two, before he sent them out to go and declare this kingdom was coming, they asked some questions and he responded in this way. He said, don't worry about how to respond or what to say. God will give you the right words at the right time, for it is not you who will be speaking, it will be the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. In John chapter 9, after this man is healed, the Pharisees ask him many questions on how are you able to see? Who is this Jesus? What do you have to say about him? This blind man hadn't gone to seminary. He wasn't an apologist or an evangelist or a pastor. In fact, it's not until 10 or 12 verses later that he actually finds out who Jesus is. He doesn't even know who Jesus is. He's just this guy they call Jesus. And yet these religious leaders are intent on getting a specific answer from him saying, hey, this guy's a sinner, you need to agree with us. And yet, even though he was pressured to give a certain answer, the blind man had the courage to say, I don't know. He literally says, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. But he goes on and repeats what he feels called to say, but this I do know, that I was blind and now I see. He says, I can't tell you all the answers, but I can just tell you what I've experienced. I can tell you what God has done in my life. That's the question I can answer. I can't answer any other of your questions because I don't know. You see, some are called to be evangelists and apostles and pastors and philosophers and debaters, and they might have more answers than I do or than you do, but we're all called to share our story regardless, even if we don't know the answers. Sometimes we have a fear of discomfort. Sometimes it's a fear of ignorance. Sometimes it's a fear of relevance, of being irrelevant, meaning my testimony is not going to make a difference either. The Coffee and Connect question today was, what's your favorite fairy tale? And I brought my favorite fairy tale with me because I have kids. I don't normally have fairy tales just lying around my house until I had kids. My favorite story is Jack and the Beanstalk. Anybody not heard of Jack and the Beanstalk? I think we all at least know a little bit about that story, I assume. If not, we can talk later about how you're deprived as a child, and we can go through that trauma. But it's one of my favorites because it's a great imaginative story. It's amazing. But I also love the story because it's one of the stories my grandma used to tell me every time we went to her house, or at least it was one of the half a dozen stories that she chose from. As the youngest of 4 kids, I was usually the one that got to sleep with Grandma when we went to Grandma's house. And although I was the only one that was allowed to sleep in her room before bed, my siblings and I would go and get on Grandma's bed and she'd tell us a story. And it was great that Grandma told the stories because she had amazing voices. And not only did she have voices for every character, but she was in her 70s at that time, and she had false teeth. And by the time she got to bed, her false teeth were already out, and so that just made the story so much better. I don't know why. But Jack and the Beanstalk was one of the stories she would always share, one of their favorite stories to share. And I remember telling my kids this story later on, and I didn't realize that literally the giant talks about grinding bones into bread. And Alicia, the first time I told it, she said, oh, should we should we say that word? Should we change the words for our kids? And I said, I don't know. My grandma always said, well, grind your bones into bread. She would always say it that way, and I didn't know what it meant. And I was fine. And so we can, again, maybe my kids need to go through some kind of trauma healing someday. But I loved this story. I always loved this story. There are several versions of it that exist, but I'm going to do what most pastors probably won't. I'm going to read the short version of this story, and you won't be able to see the pictures. You can look at it later if you really forget what it looks like. I'm going to read the 2-minute version of the story, and then we'll talk about how that relates to our story and why it matters. So, just sit back and enjoy for a moment. Something you've probably never done, and hear a fairy tale be read to you on a Sunday morning. So it goes like this. It says, once upon a time, there was a boy called Jack. He and his mother were poor, so very poor that they had to sell their cow. Jack was on the way to market with her when he met a little old man. I'll give you a bag of magic beans for your cow, said the man. I'm not grandma, so I can't do good voices, sorry. I'll give you a bag of magic beans for your cow, said the man. Great, said Jack with a grin. He gave his cow to the man and took the wrinkled beans home. But his mother wasn't happy. What are these, she wailed, knocking the beans out of his hand. Now we have no cow and no money for food either. Jack and his mother went to bed hungry that night. In the morning, Jack leaped out of bed. Something had grown in the night, right past his window. It was a giant beanstalk. Jack clambered out of the window and onto the beanstalk. He climbed up and up and up until he reached the clouds. At the top of the beanstalk, he found a giant castle with a giantess on the doorstep. Please, can you give me some breakfast? Jack begged. The giantess peered down at him in surprise. Come inside, she said. She gave Jack some bread and cheese. Thank you, he cried and ate it hungrily. Hurry up, she said. My husband will be here soon, and he eats little children like you. Probably not a great story to share before bed to your kids either. Just then, the kitchen began to shake with giant footsteps. Quick, hide, hissed the giantess. Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman, roared the giant. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. It's just your dinner cooking, said the giantess. Sit down and I'll bring it. So the giant sat down, in a beautiful golden cage, he sat down on the table beside him. "Lay, little hen, lay and make me rich," he said, and lifted the cage off the hen. To Jack's amazement, the hen laid an egg of pure gold. Jack dashed out, grabbed the hen, and fled. Jack scrambled down the beanstalk, and bellowing with anger, the giant chased after. "Quick," Jack yelled to his mother, "bring axes." They chopped down the beanstalk, and the giant was flung far over the hills, and they never saw him again. As for Jack and his mother, they sold the hen's golden eggs and had plenty to eat for the rest of their happy lives. The end. And just like that, everybody's happy again. Everybody's fed, and it's wonderful. So the question is, why do we love fairy tales like that? Why are they so captivating? Why, even though you've probably heard that story a dozen times, you would have felt something was wrong if I stopped halfway through? You're like, we got to finish the story. Why do we love them so much? It could be because they're imaginative, because we really do want there to be giant beanstalks and giants to live in the sky. It could be. But another reason I realized this past week that I like fairy tales is because in the fairy tales, they skip all the boring parts. Did you notice that? There are no boring parts in that story. I was imagining this past week if Jack and the Beanstalk included the normal parts of life like it would be in my life with my 5-year-old or my 2-year-old. You see, we don't hear about all that happened, for instance, to get that cow to be sold. You literally hear the mother say, well, we have to sell the cow, and the next thing you know, Jack's on his way to sell the cow, and he runs into this old creepy man. But if it was in my story, in my family, it doesn't talk about how 99% of boys in the family would have complained for a while and said, why do I have to be the one to sell the cow? We don't talk about that. We don't talk about how he went on, and finally he decided to go outside. Okay, I'll sell the cow. And because they had a cow, and he didn't have much land, they were poor, old Bessie had been putting cow pies everywhere, and of course, Jack probably would have stepped in the cow pie. We don't hear about that. He probably would have had to go out inside to clean off his shoes, and of course, they were poor, so they probably would have run out of water, had to take the bucket back into town to get the water to clean off his shoe. We don't hear about all those things. We just hear suddenly he went from, I need to sell the cow, to now he's on the way to sell the cow, and he runs into a man with beans. There are a whole lot of steps that happen there. You who have kids, or if you were a kid, or you have a nephew or niece, nothing happens quickly. Most likely, by the time you actually got ready to sell the cow, it was dark and you had to wait till the next day. That would have happened in my family. We don't hear about those parts of the story. You see, a creepy man with magic beans is much more exciting than waiting in line to fill up your bucket with water so you can clean your shoe from the cow pie you stepped in. That's realistic. That's kind of boring. No one wants to hear about standing in line and waiting to clean off your shoe. So authors don't add those kind of things in fairy tales. We want to hear about the exciting things, right? We want to skip the boring parts and get to the impossible fantasy. See, some of us who live or grew up in the church, we don't think our testimonies, our stories are very exciting. We want to hear about the man with the beans. We want to hear a story about the giant in the sky, and the exciting things, not necessarily just the cow pies and the everyday cows and the waiting in line part. See, for those of us who have never really had a long series of backsliding in the church, weren't addicted to drugs and alcohol in our lives at any point. We perhaps have always been part of the church. That doesn't sound very exciting. We accepted Jesus at the age of 4 or 5 or 6 maybe, and then we've always kind of followed Jesus. We haven't had those crazy things happen in our lives. We haven't had a life story where someone may look at you and say, wow, that was what you were like before you accepted Jesus? That's amazing. That's what you're like now? I would have never known. As a result, we somehow don't think that people can relate to our story. Non-Christians whose stories don't look like ours, well, my story's irrelevant. I don't need to share mine. Let's find someone who has a better testimony than mine. Let them share instead. So we believe that our testimony is equally irrelevant. I was thinking about the 12 disciples. All the time they witnessed amazing miracles, like this miracle in John chapter 9 where this guy had been literally blind for decades, and then one day Jesus, just like that, heals him. I wonder if I was one of the disciples, what I would think if I started comparing my story. I thought about Simon Peter. He's like, I was just a fisherman like everybody else, and I walked out of the boat, and now I'm following Jesus. I wasn't blind. I wasn't like Mary Magdalene and I had all these demons in me. I wasn't like Lazarus who was dead and raised back to life. Let him share his testimony next week. I don't want to share my testimony. Mine's not near as exciting. I wasn't even a tax collector like Matthew and walked away from all this money. I was just a poor fisherman and now I'm a poor guy that follows Jesus. I wonder if they would have felt like their story wasn't worth telling because their story was maybe boring compared to everybody else they were encountering. But I remember this past week as I read the story that everyone's transformation story in Jesus is quite different. And since I grew up in the church, people's stories that sound like mine sound pretty boring to me. Now, if you were raised in a gang or you were raised in a brothel, then that's more exciting. Or if something happened to you where there was a complete change in your life at the age of 46 and now you're completely different, that's a testimony I think that's maybe worth sharing. And yet I realized if you were a part of the majority of our world and you didn't have a father and you're not like me where your parents are celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary this summer, those stories are not boring to most people in the world. Those are incredible stories because many of the people we know, they didn't have a father growing up or they weren't much of a father or they didn't have parents that stayed together. They had these family secrets that they don't really want to talk about, that everybody else doesn't want to talk about. For most people in our world, living in the light of the kingdom and under the authority of Jesus is anything but normal. It's uncommon. But somehow, many of us who have the normal story, the common story, we think it's common, we think it's not worth sharing, it's not very exciting, and so we have a fear that ours will be irrelevant. But perhaps the boring stories are some of the most powerful in our world because they're more uncommon than we think. Because Jesus still transforms us, but maybe he's just prevented us from going through some of the terrible things that our friends did because we followed Jesus, or our parents followed Jesus, or our grandparents followed Jesus too. Do you share your story? Are you afraid to share your story? Are you not sure if you should share your story if you follow Jesus? Do you have a fear of discomfort, of ignorance, or that your story is somehow irrelevant? Every week at LifeBridge, we take some time and we do some roundtable discussion. Normally, it's about halfway through the sermon, but today we're going to do it at the tail end of our sermon. As you listen today, you probably found yourself in one of two categories. Either you found yourself realizing that God has already written your transformation story, and you have a story of before and after. It may have been when you're 4 years old, so there wasn't much before, but if you're following Jesus, you have a story of how God has either kept you from certain things or saved you from certain things, or you have a story. Or you're not following Jesus and you don't have that story and God hasn't written your story yet. You're one of those two categories probably. So today, if we can, I'd like to create a space temporarily where we remove some of those fears. Because it's hard to actually share your story when there are fears everywhere. And so as a church, we have to be a place where we equip each other. If we're going to do this, we have to have practice doing it and we have to equip each other. And so I want to temporarily take away perhaps the discomfort. I want to take away maybe temporarily the ignorance or the fear of ignorance and the fear of irrelevance. I want to invite you today to share part of your story. You don't need to share the two-hour version of your story. We don't have time for that. But I want to take about 10 minutes as we close. And if you are following Jesus, if you have some sort of story, I want you to take some time and to share 3 or 4 minutes. Say, this is where I was. This is what my family looked like. This is how I followed Jesus. And people around me, perhaps, this is how I was different than those, my friends who didn't follow Jesus. And if you don't have a life story like that, just take some time to listen. Or if you're not ready to share your story, still listen and learn from each other. Because someday, whether it's today or tomorrow or this week or later on, we're going to have to be prepared, as we're told, to give an answer to anybody asks the hope that we have. And if we don't practice in this space, this hopefully should be one of the safest spaces to do that. I encourage you, when someone shares your story this morning, don't ask them a dozen questions of how they do that and why did Jesus do that? I didn't do that. We don't know. It's okay. We may not know the answers. We just want to create safe spaces to tell and share a story so that when the time comes, when the fears do come up, we've had some time to be equipped in the church to share. It's not a time to give the 4 spiritual laws or share all the reasons why people should come to faith. It's just to say, hey, maybe we need to share with each other what Christ has done in our lives. So we're going to take some time. Again, you're welcome to share. You don't have to share, but you're encouraged to take 3 or 4 minutes to share your own story. And it'll take about 10 minutes with this, 5 or 10 minutes, and share, listen. If you need to combine tables and have more people, you can do that too. And then we'll close in a little bit. I'll come back up in about 8 or 10 minutes, and we'll close with a song and with some prayer. So let's take some time to share story this morning. Here in just a minute, and afterwards you can continue sharing your story. Just a reminder, about 10 minutes after we've concluded today, if you're welcome to go back to the fellowship hall to help us set up some chairs. You're also welcome to keep talking in here as well. We'll do that in about 10 minutes or so. But as we prepare to close, I want to say thank you for being willing to share, for being willing to listen. It's something we're called to do, and hopefully this is a safe place to practice more and more. So as we close, would you bow your heads with me? I'm going to pray for us, and then we'll close with a song in just a minute. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for today. Lord, thank you for the gospel story. Lord, thank you for today being Palm Sunday, Lord. Next Sunday being Easter, Lord. For this week being Passion Week or Holy Week. I thank you for the ways that you love us, God, the ways that you have changed and redeemed us. I thank you for the church, Lord, and our story. And I thank you for the opportunities you give to share our story, Lord. I pray, as we begin in prayer, for the opportunities to listen, to hear the stories of others, even if they don't include you. God, give us opportunities to listen, and eventually give us the words to speak, Holy Spirit. Thank you for this time this morning to practice, to prepare. Continue to equip us in your power, not ours, Lord. And Lord, may we get a glimpse of heaven, a glimpse of what it's going to be like being fully, completely with you in the kingdom. As a church, may we have more and more glimpses of the kingdom of heaven as you bring the kingdom to earth, as we partner with you to repent. The kingdom of heaven is near. Be with us as we go from this place, Lord. Give us imagination, even when we see impossibilities all around us, Lord. Bring change and transformation in this place and through us like you have in us. Bless us as we go and build bridges to Jesus. I pray these things in the power of Jesus Christ. Amen.